He said it in front of everyone. In front of the entire floor, 43 people who had worked alongside me for years, people I'd shared coffee with at 6 in the morning, people I'd helped navigate union audits and CRA reviews and payroll crises that nobody else even knew were happening. He stood at the front of the room with his arms crossed and said, "We're trimming the deadweight, effective immediately." And I just nodded. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam anything down. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out my access card and my building key. The physical one, the old brass one that opened the server room in the basement, and I slid them across the boardroom table without a word. The room went completely silent. That was a Thursday afternoon in late October. By Monday morning, the company was in crisis. And I was sitting at my kitchen table in Oakville, drinking coffee and watching the geese on the lake out back. Let me start from the beginning. My name doesn't matter much to this story, but what I did for 31 years at Caldwell Freight Solutions does. I started there in my late 20s as a junior logistics coordinator. Back then, the company was a mid-sized freight brokerage out of Burlington, Ontario. Family-owned, about 60 employees, the kind of place where the founder knew your kids' names and asked about your parents at the Christmas party. I worked my way up slowly. Not because I wasn't capable, but because I believed in doing things properly. Every system I touched I understood completely before I tried to improve it. Every relationship I built with a carrier, a customs broker, a port authority contact in Halifax or Vancouver, I built it over years of showing up, following through, and never making promises I couldn't keep. By the time I was in my late 40s, I was the operations director. But that title didn't capture what I actually was to the company. I was the institutional memory. I was the person who remembered why we stopped using a particular carrier out of Calgary in 2009. Because their insurance lapsed for 6 weeks and we found out about it the hard way. I was the one who knew that our bonded warehouse approval in Windsor required renewal every March, and that if you didn't file 2 months early, you'd lose your slot in the queue. I was the one who had the personal cell number of the regional director at CBSA who'd helped us navigate a complicated import dispute back in 2014. None of that was written down anywhere. I want to be honest about that. Looking back, that was partly my fault. I kept meaning to document things properly, to create proper handover materials, to train someone to shadow me. I brought it up twice to the previous owner, a man named Mr. Caldwell, and he'd nod and say, "Good idea, we should get to that." And then we'd both get pulled into whatever emergency was happening that week. It never happened. And over time, the knowledge just accumulated inside my head like sediment, layer after layer, until I was the only one who knew how the whole system actually worked beneath the surface. Mr. Caldwell retired 4 years ago. He sold the company to a private equity group out of Toronto. They brought in a new CEO, a 40-year-old who'd spent the previous decade doing operational transformations at various logistics companies, which mostly seemed to mean cutting staff and rebranding the website. He arrived with a lot of energy and a lot of language about disruption and efficiency and shedding legacy thinking. I tried to work with him. I genuinely did. In the first month, I gave him a full briefing, 4 hours across 2 sessions, on everything critical I could think of. Our carrier relationships, our compliance obligations, our seasonal patterns, the quirks in our warehouse management system that our IT team had never fully resolved. He listened politely, took some notes, and then told me he was bringing in a consultant to audit our processes and identify areas of optimization. The consultant was 28 years old. He spent 3 weeks walking around with a clipboard and then produced a report recommending we consolidate our carrier base from 42 approved carriers to 12, eliminate our in-house customs coordination function and outsource it to a firm in Mississauga, and, his phrase, reduce dependence on legacy personnel. That last one was me, I found out later, but at the time the new CEO didn't act on it immediately. He spent another year trying to implement the other recommendations, most of which caused moderate chaos but nothing catastrophic. We lost 2 major clients during that period. He blamed market conditions. What finally set things in motion was a disagreement about our bonded carrier certification. I'd been managing our compliance with Transport Canada's bonded carrier program for over a decade. It required meticulous record-keeping and regular audits, not complicated work, but work that required consistency and institutional knowledge to do correctly. The new CEO decided we should outsource the compliance management to the same Mississauga firm handling customs. I told him that was a mistake, not rude. I laid out the reasons calmly. The firm didn't have experience with our specific carrier configurations, the transition itself carried regulatory risk, and we had a routine audit scheduled in 8 months that I was already preparing documentation for. He looked at me across his desk and said, "I appreciate your concern, but I think you're too attached to how things used to be done." That was the moment I understood. It wasn't about efficiency, it wasn't even about cost. He wanted the company to be his. He needed to feel like he'd built something, and to do that he needed to remove anything that predated him. I was the most visible symbol of what predated him. 3 months later he called the all-staff meeting. I had some idea it was coming. His assistant had been unusually cold to me for 2 weeks. My access to certain shared drives had been quietly restricted. Little things, the kind of things you notice when you've been in an organization long enough to read its weather. But I didn't expect him to do it in public. He stood up at the front of the room and launched into a speech about the company's new direction and building a leaner team for the future. Then he turned to me, in front of everyone, and said that my position was being eliminated as part of a restructuring, effective immediately, and that HR would meet with me to discuss my transition package. Then he said, "I want to thank you for your years of service." He said it the way you'd thank someone for holding the door. I looked around the room. I saw the faces of people I'd worked with for decades. Some of them couldn't meet my eyes. Few looked genuinely stricken. One of my colleagues in carrier relations, a woman who'd been with the company almost as long as I had her hand over her mouth. I stood up. I buttoned my jacket. I reached into my pocket, put the access card and the brass key on the table, and I left the room. I didn't say a word. My wife was home when I arrived. She took one look at my face and just opened her arms. I stood in the hallway for a while, not crying exactly, but not quite okay either. 31 years. 31 years of early mornings and late nights and weekends spent on the phone managing crises that never appeared in anyone's performance review because I'd resolved them before they became visible. Gone in 40 seconds. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Nothing," I said. She gave me a look. "I mean it," I said. "I'm not going to do anything." What I didn't tell her in that moment, what I hadn't told anyone, was that the key I'd slid across that table wasn't just a building key. It was the only physical key in existence that opened the server room in the basement of our Burlington facility. The server room that housed the local backup systems for our warehouse management software, our carrier contract database, and critically, the encrypted archive of our bonded carrier compliance records going back 11 years. Our IT infrastructure had been a patchwork for years. When the new CEO brought in his consultant, one of the efficiency decisions had been to delay a planned cloud migration to save money in the short term, so our backup systems were still running on local servers. The server room required both a keycard swipe and a physical key to open, a dual authentication system the previous IT manager had installed in 2016, and which, in all the restructuring chaos, had never been updated to remove my credentials. My keycard had already been deactivated, presumably the moment I walked out, but the physical lock, that required a locksmith. Or the key I'd handed back. I didn't plan this, I want to be clear about that. I didn't hand back that key as part of some strategy. I handed it back because it was the company's property, and I'm not the kind of person who keeps things that don't belong to me. What happened next was not something I engineered. It was simply what happened when you remove the person who knows where everything is and how everything works. Monday morning. I was on my second cup of coffee when my former colleague from Carrier Relations called my cell. "I'm not supposed to call you," she said, her voice low. "But I thought you should know. They can't get into the server room." Apparently, when the IT team had come in Monday morning to begin the transition of my responsibilities to a junior coordinator and an external consultant, they'd discovered that the server room required a key nobody had. The CEO had assumed apparently that facility management had a spare. Facility management assumed he had one. Nobody had checked. They called a locksmith. The locksmith was able to get the door open by mid-morning, which was fine as far as it went. But what they found inside was a system that nobody except me fully understood. Our warehouse management software was running on a configuration I had customized significantly over the years, not maliciously, but practically. The standard configuration didn't account for the way we'd structured our carrier zones or our cross-border documentation flow. I'd worked with our previous IT manager to build workarounds, and those workarounds were not documented in the standard system manuals. They were documented in a set of internal notes that lived in a shared drive folder. A shared drive folder that was linked to my account. When my account was deactivated, the folder became inaccessible. The Mississauga firm the CEO had brought in for customs coordination had no context for any of this. They'd been expecting a clean handover with documented processes. What they got instead was a system built on 15 years of accumulated institutional knowledge that existed primarily inside my head. By Tuesday, the situation was compounding. Two of our major carrier partners, companies with which I had personal relationships going back over a decade, had received no contact from anyone at Caldwell since my departure. In the freight business, relationships are everything. These carriers had my cell number. A couple of them reached out to me directly, confused about who their new contact was and whether the contracts we'd been negotiating were still proceeding. I told them politely that I was no longer with the company and they should reach out to the main office for their new point of contact. I didn't say anything else. I didn't tell them the company was in disarray. I didn't encourage them to walk away. I just answered their questions honestly and wished them well. One of those carriers had been in the middle of a rate renegotiation with us. It was a significant contract, one of our top 5 by volume. Without me to continue the relationship, and with nobody at Caldwell who had any history with their regional manager, the negotiation stalled. The carrier eventually signed with a competitor. The bonded carrier audit was the worst part. When Transport Canada contacted Caldwell in late November to confirm the audit scheduled for the following February, the new compliance consultant at the Mississauga firm began pulling together the documentation. What she found, or rather what she couldn't find, was 11 years of carefully organized compliance records that I had maintained in a specific archival format required by the bonded carrier program. The records existed. They were in the system, but they were organized according to a filing structure I had built, and navigating that structure required understanding a set of internal conventions that I had never written down because I had never anticipated not being the one doing it. She spent 2 weeks trying to reconstruct the document trail. She called Caldwell's HR department asking if there was any way to reach me. HR told her my departure had been involuntary and they weren't in a position to facilitate contact. I found out about all of this gradually, through my former colleague, through a couple of the carrier contacts who stayed in touch, through the freight industry grapevine, which in Ontario is smaller than most people realize. I didn't reach out to anyone at Caldwell. I didn't offer to help. I didn't withhold anything either. I just wasn't there. Is that petty? I've thought about that question a lot. My wife asked me something similar about 6 weeks after I left. "You knew this was going to happen, didn't you?" she said one evening. We were having dinner and she was looking at me with that particular expression she has. Not accusatory, just precise. "I knew it was possible," I said. "And you didn't warn anyone." I put down my fork. I gave 4 hours of briefings when he arrived. I flagged every risk I could think of in writing. I told him specifically that the compliance transition was dangerous. He told me I was too attached to how things used to be done. She was quiet for a moment. "Fair enough," she said. "But here's what I want to say to that question. Because I've read it in enough comments and heard it from enough people since this story got around. There's a difference between withholding help and simply not being there. When I handed back that key, I was no longer an employee. I had no legal obligation to provide a transition plan beyond what I'd already offered and been ignored on. I wasn't sabotaging anything. I simply stopped carrying a weight that had never officially been acknowledged as mine to carry. If I'd been hit by a car on the way home that Thursday, the company would have faced the same crisis. The only difference is that in that scenario, nobody could argue it was personal. What made people uncomfortable was that I walked away under my own power. That somehow felt more damning than an accident. But the underlying fragility was always there. I didn't create it. I just stopped hiding it. My wife made another observation, a few months in, that I think is worth saying out loud. She said, "You know what I keep thinking? He fired you for being dead weight, but it turned out you were the only weight holding the whole structure down." She's right, and I've made peace with the fact that I bear some responsibility for that situation existing in the first place. I should have pushed harder to document things. I should have insisted loudly and in writing that the company invest in proper knowledge management. Instead, I let myself become indispensable in a way that was ultimately bad for everyone, including me. Being the only person who knows how something works is not job security. It's a liability that you carry alone, and one day it stops being your problem in the most abrupt way possible. I heard from the CEO directly in February. He sent an email to my personal address. I don't know how he got it, probably through someone in HR. The email was about 4 paragraphs long. It acknowledged that the transition had been more complex than anticipated. It said the company had faced some operational challenges since my departure. It said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that he wondered if I would be open to a conversation about a consulting arrangement to help get things back on track. It did not include an apology. I read it twice, then I forwarded it to my wife without comment. She wrote back one word, no. I replied to the CEO the following day. I told him that I was grateful he'd reached out and that I hoped the company was able to stabilize. I told him that I wasn't available for consulting work at this time, but that I wished the team well, particularly the people I'd worked alongside for years who were navigating a difficult situation through no fault of their own. He replied once more, a short message. It just said, I understand, I think I misjudged some things. That was the closest he came to an apology. I accepted it for what it was. I want to be honest about what came next, because I think people expect this kind of story to end with the villain completely destroyed and the hero vindicated in some obvious, satisfying way. That's not quite what happened. Caldwell Freight Solutions is still operating. They went through a difficult year. They lost several major carrier relationships, were found to have gaps in their bonded carrier documentation during the February audit, which resulted in a compliance notice from Transport Canada, not a full suspension, but a serious formal notice that required significant remediation work and saw their revenue drop considerably. Some of the people I'd worked with for years left the company during that period. That part wasn't satisfying to hear about at all. The new CEO is still there, as far as I know, though I've heard the private equity group brought in a new operations lead from outside and significantly reduced his authority. I got a call from a former colleague last spring. She'd landed well at another freight company in Hamilton and wanted to see if I'd consider a part-time advisory role with her new employer. I said yes, it's meaningful work and I'm doing it on my own terms for the first time in my career. I also finally wrote down everything I know, not for Caldwell, for myself and for the people I'm working with now. 47 pages of documented processes, system notes, and institutional knowledge. My wife read the first draft and said it was the most thorough thing I'd ever written. You should have done this years ago, she said. I know, I said. Why didn't you? I thought about that for a while. The honest answer is that knowing things other people didn't know made me feel safe. It was the security of being needed. Somewhere along the way, needed had become irreplaceable, and irreplaceable had become invisible, because if you're truly irreplaceable, nobody has to acknowledge your value. They just have to assume you'll always be there. The day he fired me in front of everyone, I think he assumed the same thing. He thought I was furniture. He thought he could remove a piece of furniture and rearrange the room. What he didn't understand was that the piece of furniture was also load-bearing. I'm not bitter. I want to be careful to say that clearly because I think bitterness would have been the easier thing to feel, and I chose not to. I'm 56 years old, and I'm sitting in a home I've lived in for 22 years with a wife I've been married to for 30, and I have work that matters and mornings by the lake and geese that come back every spring without fail. What I have is something better than bitterness. I have clarity. I know exactly what I was worth. And so does everyone who was in that room on that Thursday in October when he called me Deadweight and I slid my key across the table and walked out without a word. They all know now.